Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom, and we talked with special guest James Leach last time. Today, we're talking with special guest Eric Holtzclaw, Field CISO at Blackcat Security. But before we get to that, we have some beers. What are we drinking today, Eric?
Looks like we're going to drink this Stella, and the interesting thing about this one is it's non-alcoholic, so we'll give this a whirl, see what happens.
Okay. All right.
This will
and
be
you
interesting.
recommended this for us as well. Is this a narrower beer bottle, Tom? Is this smaller? Or is that just my imagination?
Elegant, Kayne. It's elegant. That's what.
Elegant. Okay.
That's kind of the shtick that Stella does. So
it's also hard to open. Okay, I brought up.
There's a will. There's always a way.
Yeah, I hope so. This is going to be the hard part of this show, apparently. Okay, there we are. Is this twist off or is this a bottle cap?
It is not.
Okay, good thing that I brought a church key up. All right, hey, look at that. I got into it.
Well, it looks like beer.
It smells like beer.
It has a wonderful, surprisingly good head for a non-alcoholic. Look at that.
Do you know what, Tom, if you put non-alcoholic wine in a blender, you can pretty much make sculptures?
Oh.
Like, it's more foamy than bubble bath. It's insane.
Interesting.
I wonder what they put in there.
This is bubbly.
All right, I'm going to go straight.
So I
am right from the bottle. Let's do this.
Oh, great.
Okay,
That's
yeah,
fine.
this looks like beer. I will confirm that.
It smells
it's
like
very
beer.
Light.
It actually smells like a Stella does. So I'm not
What's
normally
a Stella supposed to smell like? Because I smell like grass.
Smell that in front of you. That's what it's supposed to smell like.
Okay, I smell like grass and something sour, kind of like sweat socks.
Yes, Stella is a kind of a, I would say, it's a European lager that has a very unique hop flavor to it. So I'm curious. I'm going to try this to see if that's the same.
It's a unique hop flavor.
It has. It's a.
Tom.
I'll get the name wrong, but I think it's Saaz or Saaz hop.
Okay, I'm gonna try the hop and see what it's like. It tastes better than it smells.
It misses some of the hoppy character of a regular Stella. I actually like that better.
Weird mouthfeel.
Well, describe it. What are you feeling?
I don't know. It was kind of like. Let me try that again. Because I ate a cracker right beforehand, but just to make sure that my palate was clean.
Just don't brush your teeth beforehand.
No. I've made that mistake once. You make that exactly once. Yeah, it's got a kind of a weird creamy mouthfeel.
Yeah, I would say that's correct. I would say it's a little creamy. It actually tastes like a light beer to me, which a lot of times
it is a light looking beer.
A lot of times, non-alcoholic beers they don't necessarily taste like a beer should. So this does.
Okay,
surprising.
Yeah, well, we'll see how mine goes after recording the episode. I'm not sure I'll have much more of that. At least it tastes better than it smells. I will say that. That is my brand promotion for them right now. But with that, let's get into some FedRAMP topics here. So, Eric, we're having you on the show because of your background with FedRAMP, and I want you to just kind of start off with an overview of your role in achieving. And we talked about this before the show. You did the first tailored FedRAMP low-impact software as a service program, right?
Correct. Yes. Yes.
So tell us about that.
Yeah, I think at the time we had been talking directly. So it started off where, was this even possible? And it was a new program that just wasn't out yet. And there was no one that was really doing it. So my role was a security manager at the time. I led other GRC compliances like SOC 2. But I knew one of the VPs at Coalfire. So I called him and I said, hey, have you heard about this program? And he's like, yeah, it's so new. Like, we've never done it. Like, we don't know anybody who's done it. And so, they're an accredited 3PAO. So I said, well, let's give it a shot. And he was like, all right, I'll send you one of my guys. And as we talked through other agencies that were doing that, we were definitely right there with somebody else. But I'm pretty sure we beat them. So yeah, we did the first one that would kind of, I think, in history.
And when was this, Eric? Like, what's the timeline?
This was probably about probably 5 years ago. It's been a while. So at the time, getting into the federal government at the time. So the backstory is that this particular company does DMARC enforcement. And so at the time, the federal government was, really enforcing it. So they gave a hard deadline by saying all federal agencies must be DMARC enforced by a certain date. With that being said, that was kind of like an advantage for our company because the company was Valmail, and they specifically did DMARC enforcement without being on a consultative side. They actually had an application that did it for you. So that was kind of our endpoint to circle around the FedRAMP and see where we can go.
Interesting.
Okay. And so walk us through some of because you were first. Being first is often, well, I think it's fair to say sometimes there's problems or challenges. So kind of walk us through, in the context of FedRAMP, what challenges you bumped into being the first low impact SaaS solution, and then how you address those.
Yeah, I would say there's a couple challenges, right? One of them was the question they came to us is like, hey, give us your vulnerability assessment. And of course, we had to do the POAM and everything. So we said, look, we do blue-green fields. So we literally burn our entire environment down every 2.5 days with a complete build. That includes, demolishing the entire cloud infrastructure and building it back up from scratch, using, infrastructure as code to do that. So with that being said, we're like, well, how do we really do this? So we created like a golden AMI that had a even antivirus running for Linux boxes, if you can believe that, like ClamAV. But we spun the whole thing up. We ran a analyzer every single 24 hours. So it would just pop up, it would patch itself, come back down, run a scan, and then that's kind of what we submitted. But in reality, they were just like, well, if it's a new environment every 2.5 days. So there's a little challenge in keeping up with that type of scenario. But I think that they were like, wow, their answer was like, we wish we could do this with our infrastructure. So obviously they're doing a lot of patch management, which obviously everybody knows can just be a nightmare. So they also considered that as like mostly a bonus because they're like, hey, these guys, the likelihood of having a vulnerability is pretty low.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. I mean, I think about most of the folks that I've talked to so far in the government, and I would say most of them struggle to see how something different can be better. So it feels like you found a good batch of folks to review that, and certainly that they could see the market improvement security would have by being torn down, patched, and rebuilt every couple days. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm imagining that if there were any threat actors in there, their dwell time was substantially limited, which is a different narrative than you usually hear about dwell time with threat actors.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And we still have to follow the process. You don't get around the process. So there is that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, but you were able to pass that. And one of the things also we're talking about low impact SaaS, but FedRAMP is trying to secure cloud services across all kinds of federal agencies. So walk us through what Tom and I normally talk about FedRAMP Moderate. So how does the tailored low impact SaaS approach differ from FedRAMP Moderate?
Yeah, so it outlines standards, a set of requirements that in the security assessment process, we kind of look for that PII. Mm-hmm. And the low impact are basically compared to moderate to high impact levels are, substantially different in the sense that this particular SaaS application, maybe recorded some IP addresses, but the PII was so low and so insignificant that we had enough role-based access controls and enough controls at that end that it just didn't have a lot of any kind of threat service, attack services that you could be looking at that were significant. Most of the cloud obviously was locked down in the sense of like, it was just for admin access only. So there just wasn't a lot of exposure in the actual data that's being transferred between and most of it's going to be DNS related. Let's just call it what it is. I mean, ultimately, they just control all their DNS records and they take a look at that. So some of it's already public anyway. And what we pulled in was basically, authentication by saying that this domain was okay to send. And then at that point, it still was on their system to actually do the rest of the controls. And then they had access to like historical data to see, like, for example, what the reject rate was and what the domain was.
Did you find, I'm a little ignorant on Li-SaaS. I'm not sure how many controls it embodies. I can tell you moderate. 300.
Yeah, I'm sure we can tell you exactly on moderate. But Tom, you've got the same question as me. Like, what are the key security controls that are under low impact SaaS?
Yeah, I mean, they're basically the same. It just comes down to, again, like what the access and what level of PIIs and those controls are. You still have to do most of the process is literally the same for moderate, but it's just really adhering to those processes and matching the particular controls, and which are going to be like, role-based access, the typical stuff that you might have, like having some kind of cloud security controls, what those look like. And then, direct access to their data, which again, most of it was just public records. So there wasn't a lot of like consuming a lot of data, except for fundamentally, I would say reporting. And that was really about it.
So did you find that, you'd mentioned you'd done things like SOC 2 before. Did you find the crosswalk from programs that you had traditionally lived in to Li-SaaS to be particularly burdensome, or did it feel like a natural step?
I would say that most of the controls, except for like, the HR type of stuff, were almost very similar to like a SOC 2 control, because that, there was a subset of, I can't remember off the top of my head. There might have been like, I don't know, like 100 plus controls, but it wasn't anything crazy. And they mapped over pretty well, except for the HR and the IT type stuff. But anything on the application side were like very similar. So it wasn't too hard. It was just going through them methodically one at a time, which takes time. And but we were able to do it in a short amount of time.
I'm pretty sure, Tom, that sounds familiar to you, doing it methodically, one at a time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. My goodness.
I wish I got to do it one at a time.
Oh my, wow. Well, if you're enjoying this conversation on YouTube, ring the bell to get notifications about any beer that I might actually like or find to be drinkable, or subscribe to this in your podcast app of choice to make this podcast part of your routine. So Eric, the process of FedRAMP's authorization is known to be pretty rigorous and pretty time consuming, and you spoke a bit about that a bit at the top of the show. How did your tailored approach really impact your timeline and also the resources that you needed to get that authorization? Like, was it easier? Was it harder? What do you think?
I would definitely say it was much easier, for a bunch of reasons. But, the fact is that we had to engage, certain parts of the engineering team to look at the cloud infrastructure and how that was set up. And then we had to look at the application itself to make sure that, like, the basics, like you have multi-factor authentication, anything that you could think of that it's low-hanging fruit. Like, we can get very specific into those controls, but there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit where, again, like role-based access, full audit functions that are there just to make sure that, hey, we know who accessed what and when they accessed it. And then I would say that, like, the directive was really specific, that this kind of came out of a business development unit and that they wanted to make the deadline for what the federal government already had mandated. So what we did is we kind of lined that up and said, okay, do you think this is possible to do this in a certain amount of time? And then we talked to people, even within the federal government. Department of Commerce was the one who was kind of the stakeholder. And we said, look, can we get it by this date? And they're like, yeah, we'll give it a shot. You know, they didn't make any real like for sure commitments, but they were like, yeah, it's possible. Given this is a new thing, we can't make any promises. So we were like, okay. But then, you know, I think going with somebody like Coalfire, who is just like has so much experience in this, was really helpful. They got a really seasoned guy who came on who did like high, and so he was pretty prepared to like, you know, get through the set of controls and then get on the, you know, basically lots and lots of phone calls with them, and making sure that like each one of these controls was met properly, and that we produced the right amount of data, you know, and evidence to them that says this is actually what's happening. And then at that point, we were getting it went pretty quickly. I would say we got this within like, I don't know, 6 to 8 months, which is, you know, incredibly fast.
Wait, total like 6 to 8 months,
6 to 8.
From the time that you submitted to be like
yeah, it was pretty fast. The CISO,
6 to 8 months for the whole thing.
The CISO was very, you got to understand too, like the federal government was completely encouraged to get this done, right? We looked at a lot of the scorecards that each one of these federal government CISOs has, and I was surprised to learn. So we can backtrack a little bit. This is the first time I ever did any kind of federal compliance. So I was kind of thrown into the fire, right? I was like, I didn't really know what to expect. And as I started getting into it, everyone's like, you don't know what you're doing? Like, this is going to be very difficult. And I was like, well, I hope not, but here we go anyway. And so I heard a lot of that. And that was basically, you know, me working like lots of extra hours to make sure I was going to get this done right. We engaged with lots of people within the business, and we really had a focus to make sure this was going to happen. So, you know, VPs of engineering, the founders of the company were very much invested into making this happen. But even with that, like we still like, you know, still had to like, you know, march along and made sure this happened. So, yeah, it was pretty quick, and they wanted it because they needed to meet the same deadline. So I think at the end of the day, they were all on the same page. We all wanted the same thing. We all realized that we almost had zero PII to really look at, and that if everything else matched, like the application was secure for the low hanging fruit, that it was going to, you know, pretty easy to you know, jump in. So that's really what it comes down to, is this: the PII is going to always be the one that gets you. I think low hanging fruit, by saying you have some security controls in your cloud, you know, and you know, the security best practices are going to get you pretty far. That as long as you have a lot of those things, it makes it so much easier.
Tom, 6 to 8 months?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I was waiting for that question, Kayne.
Gotta ask.
Certainly with moderate, I think first of all, it's a well-established program now. So the government is you know, not nearly as big a hurry to get somebody through it. And that shows in the timeline. We would be lucky when we submit for our RAR to get that back in 6 months, to be honest, with how slow the government is right now. And certainly the process of implementing moderate has taken us where we're coming up on we're a year and a half right now. So so I would say that there's definitely a departure in terms of the baseline you're expected to meet between Li-SaaS and moderate, but it's for a good reason. I mean, kind of to your point, Eric, you have a different take on the data that you guys are managing, or would be a processor that for. Certainly underneath moderate, we are a processor for CUI. So that's what pushes us into the moderate landscape, and that's what creates the time barrier that moderate has.
Right. I think the other thing, though, it sounds like Eric's government sponsor, I'm assuming that the sponsor, one or more of their sponsors, probably had a real motivation, just based on what you said, Eric, right? Like they had a get deadline that they had to meet, and they'd selected the solution, and you two were able to partner on that, right?
Absolutely. And I think that was the underpinning for us, like putting all the effort into it. Because at the time, we were a startup company, right? We literally had 50 employees. So we have a pretty small shop to accomplish this particular task. So I was, you know, heavily resourced on, pulling a lot of people in from different businesses just to get this thing going. And we're still trying to acquire customers, and we're working with enterprise customers. And there was a lot of that going on. And at the same time, we were trying to simultaneously ramp up, sales, in like Herndon, Virginia, to get ready to actually sell this. So as a business, there's a lot of moving parts, and then there's the onboarding and everything else that goes along with it. But yeah, it was a pretty Herculean effort at our end to make sure all this happened. But they really made it like they were very they talked about the red box and things like that, and everything had to be in the boundaries, and they were very like the CFP package submission. They really were helpful. Like, I was surprised how often that they would talk to us, pick up the phone, do you need that? And then also with our particular rep from Coalfire, they knew who he was. So there was a lot of like, hey, we know who you are. There's this like internal trust. And so, they were very responsive, I guess. And obviously from your case, and yeah, the federal government's a different story today than it was like 8 years ago, right? It's just it could be a whole different beast depending on what the landscape looks like.
Yeah, and then just go ahead, Tom. I had a follow-on question.
I was going to say, I think that having that sort of steward to go through the process, that's a blessing. We're still in a position where we have not identified a sponsor, although we have lots of sponsors that seem interested. But I would say as soon as you have somebody who is invested in the process that you're going through and wants to see you succeed, that's huge. And certainly, we have a 3PAO that's very partnership oriented and has been through the process many times as well. I think that's going to be a key as well. It's good to hear that.
Yeah, definitely. And you kind of talked a little bit about how things have changed over time, Eric. Just looking ahead, how do you really see that tailored FedRAMP low impact SaaS is going to evolve, especially in terms of both innovation, which I hope regulations are not stifling, but also addressing the current cybersecurity threats we have and future cybersecurity threats that we might be facing?
That's a really interesting question. I think new technology has to be put into play in order to make most infrastructures more secure. And you've seen in the future where everyone's like, okay, we're going to have a vault of some type, right? Whether it's a password vault, whether it's private key vaults, whatever else you have that. And then on top of that, you might have, some kind of KMS system that manages all these keys. And therefore, as a customer, you get to own all that. And that makes it more secure from your end. So your cloud provider doesn't even know this. But I think that's just kind of the beginning of it. I think the real thing that needs to happen is we all got to look at, again, the PII, PHI, whatever data you're trying to protect needs to be also put in a vault. So what you're going to see a lot more are like what's called PII vaults. Now, these PII vaults will basically either mask the PII or fundamentally tokenize it. So when people within the organization need to have access to this, and so they need it in reporting forms, they need it just to do business, to be able to say, oh, I need to look at this guy's information to compare this or that, they're going to need access to it. But a lot of times that's a one-time access, and then they can set up one-time access so they can get it, see it, and then it just goes right back to where it was before. So, and then you're going to have a lot of data segmentation, SaaS companies that like will literally segment the data, and then you'll have, also lots of RBAC tools all the way down from like attribute-based, tools. And, that's the type of stuff that we need to keep going. And that's going to lower, the cybersecurity threats, right? I think the days of like putting everybody in one database as a SaaS company, because that's easy for you to do, is something that is not looked at very, well as far as cybersecurity people go. I look at it as like, okay, if I compromise that database and I'm in, like, you're fully breached. If I download that and the game's over and there's no getting past that. So, we've slowly incremented by saying, okay, let's at least encrypt it. But, the assumption is let's say he's coming in from an engineering guy's perspective and that's who he's breached, then the encryption's not, so it doesn't really matter because you can obviously bypass that. So that's what I see going forward, which the more tighter controls you have, and you can prove these controls work, the more likely you are to like these controls will get a little bit more relaxed because there's some sense of like, hey, they're doing something about it versus, doing what we did 10 years ago is not what we should be doing today.
Yeah,
that
evolution is critical. And my biggest fear in FedRAMP is we won't see the government quickly embrace some of the emerging technologies. If we can instead get them to understand at the point of implementation or the point of assessment what those technologies are doing and give it a pass, that's great. But if a new technology is running counter to the prevailing thought in the government, I think that's going to be a problem for some time. But we'll see. I mean, the best use cases out there right now, right? We'll see how they handle AI and tools going forward.
Yes, I think we're definitely going to see that. But I like, Eric, what you said about being able to prove that the controls are operating is really essential. I really like that because that's something I think companies have struggled with. And you think of the continuous monitoring sections of FedRAMP, that kind of speaks to, hey, you should have evidence that you're actually doing what you say that you're going to be doing. And just on that theme, so other than being able to prove that your controls are operating, Eric, any other advice for organizations or folks who are thinking about doing a tailored FedRAMP approach for their cloud services compared to going something like we're doing with FedRAMP Moderate?
I would say is get in alignment with a company that's really good at managing, your GRC platform, something that already has something built in that can go and do the POAMs, right? It's already filled out. It's ready to go. You drop your evidence in there. But if you can automate that evidence by tapping into the APIs that are already inside your cloud environment and be able to pull that information in, it's just going to make everyone's life easier. And then it is like, it's I wouldn't say it's non-repeatable, but it's pretty close to being to that, right? This isn't like, oh, we're going to give you a screenshot of something, where obviously that chain of custody is probably, not the greatest, but acceptable from most auditors. But I think that just trying to get that so it's audible but it's easy to pull in through an API. And obviously there's a lot of vendors out there that do this. I would say some are better than others, but I would say that would be my next advice, is just trying to automate whatever you can, because I think obviously AI is coming, right? There's a whole new wave of privacy, right? I've even seen like now people are getting like privacy certified, right? And it is what it is. If you want to deal with the EU, like, okay, that's great. But like now you have a whole privacy thing you're going to have to consider. And there's a lot of overlap too, right? That's where a good GRC platform can help you overlap all that and say, okay, let's use this one control. It seems to be in 3 different security frameworks. Let's gather this evidence once, and then we can present to the auditor and get like 2 birds with 1 stone type of mentality.
Sounds familiar.
It sounds like why Tom and I come to work every day.
Yeah, for sure.
No, and then, Tom, once we've got Hyperproof in a FedRAMP environment, customers could actually do that then, right?
That's right. I believe I'm going to be implemented into that FedRAMP environment in the next week. So that's how close we are.
Fantastic. And then we can collect our own evidence and test that and show it to our 3PAO.
Yeah. Sure.
Kind of exciting. Cool. Okay, I think that's a good place to close up on the technical content for this, Eric. Let's go back to the beers. Don't know if you've seen this show before, but we do our beers on a 10-point rating scale. And usually because the guests have suggested the beers, they don't go first because sometimes they influence us. Tom, what's the highest rating I've ever given for a beer? Is it a 4, I think?
I think it's a 4. Yep.
And I think your lowest has ever been a 5
but
I think your lowest is what, a 2?
Yeah.
And that was that horrible one, the Kauai art that I recommended. Yeah. Sticky cinnamon bun ale, my friend. It's terrible.
That was terrible.
Yeah. Well, do you want to review this one? Because it sounds like you've got some basis on Stella, whereas I have no basis on this one to begin with.
Well, it would be important to note that I don't typically like Stella because of one particular hop that they have in their beer. So it's something I avoid. although there's occasion where it's the one that's brought to me, so I drink it. This does taste a lot like it, although its emphasis on that hop is much less. So I actually like this better than regular Stella. This is their Liberte, their non-alcoholic. So I would give Stella probably a 3. I will give this probably a 5. It's not something I'm going to go buy, not only because it's non-alcoholic, but I like the beers that are way more hop forward, way more characteristic, more of an ale. But still, I was very much surprised by this.
Fantastic. So I will go next. I don't think I've ever had Stella before. I maintain this still smells sour, but I don't know. It's some beers just calm down, and this one has not calmed down on the nose. In terms of flavor,
it has on the drink, I think.
Yeah, it's inoffensive. Oh, actually, it's kind of a bitter note at the end now. It doesn't have that same creamy mouthfeel. I am going to give this a 3. I'm going to give this a 3 out of 10.
Which for
Kayne, me
is pretty middle of the road. That's pretty normal.
It's pretty middle of the road, even though we are on a 10-point scale ultimately. Yeah. Eric, what about you?
Well, I tend to agree with you. This does get a little bit more bitter as it sits. And I think I kind of like that, actually. The first couple drinks and then letting this thing, maybe because it gets slightly warmer, as beer gets warmer as it sits. But I kind of like that sourness. I probably give it a 4. I think there's obviously better beers out there, but I think with the craft brew out there, that's what's interesting is that you get, like you were saying, more hoppy flavors, and the flavors are just incredible, what you can get these days. So, but I mean, something you could just go and buy at Safeway. Yeah, a 4. This ain't bad.
Fantastic. Well, I think with that's all for today. If you think you know a beer I'd like, sorry, good luck with that. Or if you have a FedRAMP question, that's more likely. Drop it in the comments below, and remember to like our LinkedIn and YouTube pages to hear live interviews with other information security professionals. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for your time.